Yay, that worked.
Excellent. Welcome in. Welcome to those of you who are here with us live and those who are joining us by way of the YouTube replay. Hi, this is Mars. I would love to introduce you to this month's very special guest who we asked early in the spring if she would please be part of this adventure with us. Rachel Smith is joining us this month, and we're going to spotlight her video so that Rachel can be introduced to all of you. I will let Rachel tell you about all the wonderful things that she's doing in the fiber community. So Rachel, please introduce yourself to the Fluff to Stuff gathering.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you for inviting me. You guys had invited me early on, so thank you so much for thinking of me. So my name is Rachel. I can be found on sort of Instagram and all the places as Wool and Spinning, and also as Well for Pearls, which is kind of my old username, and I'm slowly changing things over. I'm a knitter, a spinner, a weaver, which is really fun to now be able to call myself a weaver. But my primary is spinning. So I do mostly hand spun, knitting with hand spun, and I host the podcast that's a weekly live stream called Wool and Spinning on YouTube. You can find it at youtube.com/Rachel Smith, capital R, capital S. And we talk about all things yarn and spinning. And because of the podcast, what sort of has come out of it is an amazing fiber community, sort of the woolen spinning community that gathers almost daily online, sharing all the things. Mars is nodding. And I produce sort of monthly content for everybody that's teaching that usually focuses on some sort of a theme for the month. And we talk through process, learning different fiber content, which we'll talk about later. And yeah, that's kind of what I do. And then my day job. So this used to be my side hustle, and now this is my primary hustle. And then my side hustle is now I also am a critical care nurse in a local trauma intensive care unit here in the greater Vancouver area. So I guess I should say I live just outside Vancouver, British Columbia, here in Canada. I've got two kids, 9 and 7, a boy and a girl, and I've been married for 14 years. And yeah, our favorite thing to do is camp and be outside.
Rachel, it's so good to meet you. And what I love about that introduction is that most people are going to be like me. They will find something in there on which they can connect with you. I've discovered after talking to you now for many, many months that we have a ton of things in common. And so I'm just pretty sure that someone in this group will have something that they can connect to with you, which I think is fantastic. And it says a lot about who you are as a person and who you are as a maker. So thank you for agreeing to be here with us. Yeah. It's awesome to be able to share you. I am part of the Wool and Spinning community, so pretend you're not talking to me because I know some of this stuff. Our viewers want to know, when did you start spinning and why?
Yeah. So I actually started in 2007. I have been a knitter for as long as I can remember. I was taught by my dear aunt, and she would sit in the back of our Chevy van, and in the very back row, which made her motion sick. And she would sit there anyways, and she would teach me how to knit every time they visited from England. And because my family's all from England, the south of England. And she would come for 2 weeks every spring. She would teach me how to knit. I would work on it throughout the year. And then when they'd come back the next year, she would teach me more. So then in 2007, she passed away. And she left me a small inheritance, and it was just enough in converted from pounds to US dollars to get a spinning wheel. And I had been knitting up a storm up to that point. And I had sort of started to find that knitting yarns were getting really expensive. And the yarns that I wanted to work with were quite expensive. And so I was sort of defaulting to working with what I call workhorse yarns. So the yarns that are sort of, between $7 and $10 a skein for 100 grams. And you can, knit a sweater and not feel like you've sold your left kidney to be able to knit your sweater. And so I thought the perfect solution would be to buy a spinning wheel and learn how to spin my yarn. It would be so much cheaper and I'd be able to make all the yarns and knit all the sweaters. So I started spinning. I had no idea what I was doing. At that time in 2007 to about sort of 2010, there wasn't really a lot online and there wasn't a lot of resources. There certainly weren't people video casting and podcasting and doing all the things. And there certainly wasn't online groups that you could find and that you could join. And so I was sort of on my own. And I just kept spinning singles because I didn't know how to ply. I didn't know that you needed to have a couple of bobbins and put a couple of singles together to actually make some yarn. And so I spent like years. I would buy more bobbins and I would just spin singles and spin singles. I got very good at it. And then my daughter was born in 2014 and the wheel had sat basically since my son was born a couple of years previously. And I just thought, my husband actually said to me, if you're not going to use the wheel, why don't you find out a little bit about it, get somebody to teach you how to like ply and make yarn, and then sell it. Like, if you're not going to do this, it's taking up a footprint. So I found somebody locally to me who's still one of my closest friends now. And she got me going and taught me how to ply and got me kind of going on the sort of the next steps in how to make your yarn. And I never looked back. And that was June of 2014. And all those years of spinning all of those singles made me a really good spinner because I knew how to do that at the wheel. And it was sort of the knowledge gap was that next big jump, but I had a really good foundation. And so why I continue to spin is because I love working with my yarns. Every time I work with a commercial yarn, I come back to my own yarns. And I can't say who it is because this person has a yarn business, but a very dear friend of mine who's part of the woolen spinning community, she always says to me, I work with commercial yarns, I dye them. I love looking at the samples and seeing them, but I work every day with my hand spun yarns. Right. And I think for me, that's really sums up why I continue spinning. I started because I thought it was a way to get my hands on the yarns that I wanted to get my hands on that were kind of just out of my reach. But I continue because I just love them.
That is fantastic. So much about that resonates. I think it is beautiful that you had a family member who took the time to teach you, but then she also made it possible for you to take yet another step in this fiber journey, which is fabulous. And you talking about spinning singles for years, now that I know you, doesn't seem that strange to me because of all the learning that I know would have come with that. And talk about getting to understand fiber behavior. I think that's pretty powerful. But also you talk about using this yarn and having a preference for it. There's no shame in that. This group that has been following along with us all year is really starting to produce some gorgeous yarn. And so I think we'll all take inspiration from that about using it and turning it into things. That's beautiful. So now that you've had that experience, I feel like there was probably that learning stage for you and then another learning stage before you got into becoming a teacher and kind of bringing others in with you. Maybe talk about what did you enjoy about your spinning then, and then what do you enjoy most about it now, if you don't mind comparing?
Yeah, because actually my spinning's changed quite a bit as a result of that. So it's very perceptive, Mars. So what I enjoyed about it before was just, I think some of the things that many of us say that is the reason why we spin, it's the meditativeness at the wheel, being able to zone out, being able to engage in something where you're working with sort of the raw material. One of my absolute most best friends in the whole wide world is a jeweler, and she had been in fashion design and then she switched into jewelry. And I said to her one day, we were poking around in Romney Wools, for anybody who's been to Toronto and knows that store. We were poking around in the basement and I turned to her and she was telling me about this transfer that she was doing. And I said, why are you going from fashion design into jewelry? Like, this doesn't make any sense. And she turned to me and she said, why do you spin and not just knit? And I was like, well, because I get to work with the wool, because it's the raw stuff. And she said, bingo. She said, there is no way that I would be able to earn a living weaving all of my own cloth to be able to make the clothing that I want to make. She's like, for me, it's just not realistic from like a business perspective. And she said, I wanted to work with the raw material. And so for me, when I was sort of in that learning stage with all of this, it didn't matter if I was making textured yarn or the most consistent sweater yarn or something for, throwing onto my rigid heddle. It was working from the raw fiber all the way through to a finished garment and being able to say that I had gone through that process.
You know what the suckers are?
I don't
I thought they were
necessarily.
by the.
Hold on one second, Rachel.
Hot
If
sauce?
you're not on mute, would you mind going on mute so that we can continue with the interview? Appreciate it, everybody. Thanks. Sorry, Rachel, please continue.
No, all good. It happens. So going, and you don't, like, for me, I wasn't necessarily working from like raw fleece. But it is that opportunity to go from sort of this fluff, that's sort of yours to create with what you want. And that the opportunity there just kind of almost was a bit mind-boggling. I almost sort of felt a bit overwhelmed by that at first. And that's where the teaching came in. So then it started organically to just sort of evolve and move and shift into this sharing what I was learning and what I was being exposed to. And so now what keeps me going is all of the sampling. And there's this joke in our community where if anybody asks for any advice, it's sort of this joke now that whoever gets on there first to answer says, you've got to sample. And that's really what keeps me going now, because you start to sort of spin all of these different fibers that as hand spinners are available to us now compared to say 10, 15, 30 years ago. Even 5 years ago, there wasn't the variety on the market that there is now. And all of a sudden, this whole world opens up to you. And if you're somebody who naturally is a lifelong learner, because some people, that's just not their deal. But if you sort of naturally kind of sort of lean in that personality direction, the possibilities are endless. And I think the more technically minded you are, it opens up even more options and even more ideas. And it's like this sort of cart that just keeps on going,
Yes.
and it keeps rolling forward.
Yeah, I think whether you're doing it intentionally to seek out new learning or not, those learning stages are going to come as long as you continue with the craft.
Yeah,
It makes a lot of sense. And I think that it's a huge leap to take yourself from that stage and then welcome in others and try to move them through that stage. And I know you do that as a teacher. You've done that with some of the books that you've written very specific to types of spinning. And I think I've even heard this from you in terms of weaving and what you're learning about weaving with your hand spun. So you're kind of always taking yourself back into that learning mode and being new at something, which is great.
Yeah.
I can't imagine it's all roses. So what frustrates you about spinning, whether you're spinning or just the craft itself? Is there anything that frustrates you about it?
Yeah, I think with all of them, it doesn't matter what we're talking about, whether it's knitting, spinning, weaving, specifically though spinning and weaving. The big thing for me is the time that it takes to spin yardage. You just have to be at the wheel for many hours spinning that yardage. And so to get enough yardage for spinning or to get enough yardage for the woven cloth, which is sort of my magnum opus, if you will. My long-term goal is to weave yardage with hand spun. That's what's really frustrating for me, is that there's just a certain amount of time that you need, and there is no piece of equipment, no magic bullet, no magic pill that will help you to spin that faster. You just have to put in the time. And it really, And so I find that frustrating because obviously I would like to just spin all day, every day. But I also find once you get into the middle of a project, especially a big spinning project where you've you know what you're spinning, now you just need to get it done. You're kind of into the slog of the middle of the project.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work and it's not that interesting. Like, let's be totally honest. This is work that was traditionally given to women because we had babies on our back. We had kids that needed us and care that needed to be done. And you could spin sort of through all of those things. If anybody's read women's work, it's a great book about textiles and the history of women's work. And I think sometimes that just sort of that slog of going through those big projects, let's face it, time is our biggest stress, and feeling constrained. So
totally.
Yeah.
And we're making materials.
Yeah.
So when you are done with that slog, which I completely identify with, and I think some of our viewers do as well, now you've made a material, and then there's the time that it's going to take you to make the next thing, unless your hand spun is your FO, which in this community we fully support that. That the hand spun skeins themselves could be your finished object. But I agree with you about the time, because there really isn't much that you can do about it. I don't know of anyone who can spin all day, regardless of how much we'd like to. So the time is finite in that way. Thank you for sharing that. That's awesome. With all that you know now, and knowing that you probably get asked for a lot of help in getting started, what's kind of some of your key advice for new spinners?
Yeah, I love this question. I wish I was asked it more often, because I think that there's a few things that I think I unintentionally did that I didn't even realize were things that really helped to set me up for success. The first thing is find someone either in person or virtually that you connect with that will kind of act like a spinning mentor to you, and somebody that you can ask those dumb questions like that you're sort of at the beginning of your journey feeling like, this is probably really obvious, but like, how do I use a nitty naughty? You have to learn these things, and you just need somebody to show you and to kind of take you under their wing and to help you. And the thing is that they don't have to be an intermediate or a master spinner. I think that's what people will find surprising. They just need to be a tiny bit ahead of you in their spinning journey, so that they can show you a few things, so that they can just sort of say, well, this is how I do it, or this is how somebody showed me. And the chances are, if you're really into spinning and you're really wanting to sort of become quite proficient, you're probably going to outgrow them. And it doesn't matter, because you'll be surprised at what you'll kind of bring to one another. And like, even just our community, people are constantly mentoring one another. And, obviously I mentor people just by the nature of sort of what I do. And it doesn't matter if your expertise is a little bit different, or if your expertise are in something else, you always have something to learn. And usually one of the things that I've really noticed is what they're interested in and what you're interested in often deviates. So they kind of show you some of those basic things like how to ply, but they might be really passionate about color. And you're sort of like, yeah, color's interesting, but I'm really into the structure, which is exactly what happened with me with both of my mentors. And they're still mentors of mine now, even though I would consider us all very, very similar in terms of our skill level. But one is incredibly passionate about spindles. One is incredibly passionate about color and luxury fibers, specifically silk. And here I am all about just structure. I just want to talk about structure.
Woolly wools and how to ply them. Yep.
Exactly. How do you make the best sweater? How do you do that?
Right.
And of course, now I'm sort of delving into sort of the world of weaving with your hand spun, sort of this idea of spin to weave. The other thing that I would say is try as best as you can. This goes against many grains that many of us have just built into our personalities, but try to resist saying, I don't like that. I don't like spindles. I don't like support spindling. I don't like cotton. I don't like e-spinners. I don't like blah, blah, blah. Fill in the blank. Because I think when I first started spinning, I definitely did that. Like, oh, I don't like cotton, or no, spindles aren't really for me. You don't know what you are going to like and what you will try as you go through your journey from true beginner to true expert, which is sort of, nobody's a true expert, but let's face it, we're all kind of somewhere on that continuum. You don't know what you will enjoy and what you will like as you go through your journey and learn more things. You know, you might spin on a treadle wheel for 5-10 years, like I did, and then come back to spindles and go, well, where were these all my life? Like, these are so simple. I love this. But when I had first been exposed to it, I was given an incredibly heavy student spindle, you know, one of those old clunky ones. And I was sort of like, you want me to do what with what and put what on who? So I would really encourage you just to keep a really open mind. And then the other thing, and this kind of goes back to my frustration question that we were just talking about. You need, if you would like, this is just a little bit of tough love. If you want to become a good spinner, you need to spin a lot. I often get questions, how do you spin the yarns that you spin? How are they so consistent? How are you able to go between fibers and spin whatever and get twist in there and get them spun? It's because I spin a lot. I think people would be shocked at how much time I spend spinning, whether it's on a spindle or a treadle wheel or my e-spinners. And if you want to become a good spinner, you have to put your knitting needles aside, even if knitting is easier for you because you've been doing it for longer, especially as, you know, sort of knitters become spinners, sort of that transition. You need to spend a lot of time at your wheel. And sometimes I actually think spinners that come to spinning without knitting are actually at an advantage because they don't just default to what's easy for them, which is knitting without looking and chatting with your friends, right? And I certainly did that for the first few years when I was first learning and just spinning my singles. Knitting was easier. And, you know, it wasn't as hard as spinning. So if you want to really master this, it goes back to that whole 10,000 hours thing and Erik Erikson stuff. It's not just spinning and just sitting there and treadling and making the same thing over and over again. It's intentional practice. And that goes back to finding the mentor and somebody who will kind of push you and say, yeah, those singles are great. Let's try this. You know, yeah, that plying's great. Let's try this. Let's build on that.
That's fantastic. It's an intentional commitment to the craft in a way that will pay off. I can 100%. Say that since joining your Patreon community, I have picture proof that I did not used to sample. I had never tried anything beyond 2-ply. I thought, you know, art yarn and e-spinners and different fibers were for somebody else. I had all these preconceived notions. So what you consider tough love, I consider it's just the truth of getting good at something. You have to put the time in. And what I loved about what you said about mentoring is another thing I've seen in your community is the people who start out as the newbies and ask the newbie questions. There is a beautiful dynamic that happens because they ask the newbie questions and someone else gets to see their own progress by answering that question or even being that mentor role in some way. And then as they move into that mentor role, I know certain things now that I didn't before. I go in there sometimes to look at a newbie question just in case. Because someone's going to say something that I haven't thought of yet, or they will answer a question differently than I would have, and it gives me something to think about. So that cycle is happening in, you know, over and over again for different people. I think it's great advice. Anybody watching this or listening to this, if you feel like you're neither one of those yet, it's a matter of being open to becoming the person asking the question or the person answering the question, right? The I don't like, totally guilty.
Me too. That's why I say
totally
it.
guilty. I
Yep.
think about things like art yarn. I thought, why would I make art yarn? I'm not, I'm not into that kind of yarn for knitting a sweater. Well, show me one beautiful woven wall hanging, and I'm like, I want to know how to do that. Okay, that's just taking the format into a different area. So I think you're giving us even us non-newbies, you're giving us some really good advice there.
Well, and I will say about textured yarn or art yarn, some people call it art yarn, some people call it textured yarn. I personally call it textured yarn. So when I say textured, I'm talking about art yarn. Even if you think that you're never going to use it, I would really recommend that you learn how to make it, because when you come back to your traditional spinning or your conventional spinning, you will be a better spinner, because you actually have to learn where does that twist go when you add it. So if you're used to only spinning, this is just a classic example. If you're used to spinning all of your singles in the Z direction, so your wheel is going counterclockwise, and then you ply all of your yarn in the S direction going clockwise. If all of your yarn is made that way, what do? If you not only do it backwards, so you're going to spin your singles Z, ply S, spin your singles S, ply Z. Now I'm confused. And then let's do it again. Let's cable it back on itself, or let's make and when you come back to your conventional yarns, that understanding of how twist acts and where it goes is revolutionary. It will make you a better spinner. So even if you end up with a box full of textured yarns that you're never going to use, that are maybe completely fugly, so funny looking and ugly, just make them anyways.
Yeah.
And
you know what?
stash
Someone in the fiber community will want that too.
Absolutely.
There's so many great uses for even our trials. That's great advice.
Yeah.
So in these number of years, you've been through stash that you've made. You've probably been through stash of hand spun and other fibers that you've gotten from others. What would be your most precious, or something that's really soulful for you from your stash?
Yeah, this is a really good question. It's a hard one to answer because I have a few things. So we finished up last year. We worked our way through JC Boggs Faulkner's book, 51 Yarns, and the November of the second, it was the second to last month of our 2-year spin along. And we actually have another group that's just finishing up with it again this fall. One of the final yarns was an emotional yarn. And this was sort of the first time that I was sort of forced to stop and look at some of these things as a maker and sort of share more openly about some of this stuff, because, some of these yarns you don't or stash, you don't necessarily want to share really super openly on the podcast or in a blog post, or, some of it can be really super personal. And some of the things that were shared that month by the community as they worked through their 51 yarns was just incredible. And we actually had one shared yesterday on the podcast on the live stream. And we've had a few. So I have a couple. Mina, do I have screen sharing options?
1 second, I'll
talk while Mina's doing that. You just need to give participants.
I don't seem to have that option, so you're just host.
Oh, I got it. You gave it to me.
I made you host.
Oh.
Just pass it back once you're done.
Just make it simple. So I had made with my friend Diana, we had bought a fleece together, and it was this Clun Forest fleece, and it was local, and we had washed it all. It was my first sort of fleece to finish sweater. It was this local Clun Forest. There was a lot of down breeds in the greater Vancouver area. There's a lot of Suffolk do very, very well. North County Cheviot do very well. There's a lot of Clun Forest. There's a lot of Rideau Arcot. There's just a lot of like those types of sort of down wools, and many of us who live here and spin and whatnot have a real love for them. So her and I, in my first fleece to finished something, had carded up the entire fleece together. So I had never sort of gone through that process together, and it wasn't a super, super small fleece. Anyways, long story short, I got it all carded up, and those bats ended up in my stash for years. And I think part of it was feeling really overwhelmed by the sheer amount of spinning from these bats, this really bouncy, springy, downy, just beautiful yarn. And it got stashed. So working through that process with my friend Diana was awesome, but then it got stashed. And then my dad got very, very sick in the summer of 2019. And from diagnosis to palliation and to the day that he actually passed away was only about 10 days. And so afterwards, this was in August of 2019, afterwards, just in processing everything and going through all of the things, I started spinning those bats. And I spun, and I spun, and I spun, and I gave the yarn, the finished yarn, I gave to my friend Katrina, my dear friend. She's one of my best friends in the world. She's the dyer and creative director of Crafty Jacks. I gave this to her and I said, dye this my favorite color, please. And I'm going to knit a sweater. And this is what I knit. So this is the Clun Forest fleece. She dyed it in the colorway Goldfinch, which is also the same color as the t-shirt I'm wearing. And this is Marie Chen by Isabel Kramer. And, you know, I haven't worn this sweater a lot. I think mostly because it's one of those things that has so much emotional meaning. It's also a wee bit too big, but that's okay. That in terms of like a soulful thing, you know, you go from this almost kind of workhorse, kind of almost, you know, these sheep that are, they're nothing kind of special. And I don't mean that as a slight against Clun Forest. They're just down wools often get overlooked. Beth Smith is a big proponent of the downs because they are so often overlooked. So that's the one. And then the other thing I wanted to share with you guys was one of the things as spinners that we often are sort of, you know, told when we first start spinning is that cashmere is too hard. It's too hard to spin cashmere.
Wow.
These are different cashmere yarns. So the green one is a cashmere, it's 50-50 cashmere wool. And the white one is 100% cashmere, and then the other two are actually silk. And I think one of the things that I learned in spinning these yarns is that let me find a pretty one, is that they really make you realize, so these are 100% cashmere yarns. It's expensive to purchase cashmere. It's really, really hard to get really nice cashmere. We happen to have a farm here in British Columbia called Harmony Farms. They're up in the interior of British Columbia, and Heidi is absolutely lovely. And she de-hairs the cashmere and sells it, and it's worth it. It costs an arm and a leg. It's just being honest. But you know, I have about 40-50 grams left of it in my stash, and I think that it's one of those things where I sat with her at one of the knit cities one year, and she actually taught me and my friend Kim McKenna how to spin it. And the biggest thing was making sure that there's enough twist in it. A lot of people think that their cashmere yarns are adequately twisted, and they actually need a significantly more amount of twist. And these were 3-ply yarns that you just saw the photos of. And I think I really value being able to delve into some of this stash and some of these yarns and these fibers, and have the opportunity to work with them. And they're precious, you know, and my friend Rebecca lives up in Rankin Inlet in Nunavut, and she's very generously sent me a little bit of Kiviot over the years, and other people in the community have benefited from that as well. And you just really appreciate that when those muskoxen hides are found, especially if they're enough, by the local hunters, that family gets to eat that night. And that takes it from this whole level of, it's, kivy, it's very expensive, it's difficult to get, do I really want to spend my money on this, blah, blah, blah. And then you have groups like Nunavut Kiviat who are making sure that those hunters are, especially when they find the muskoxen that are already fallen, so they're struggling, it's actually kinder to put them out of their misery, because they're usually hurt or lame or something's happened. And now that family has been paid an amount that actually will sustain them and allow their family to eat. And that, to me, makes these things really, yes, they're rare, yes, they're luxurious, but they're also incredibly precious.
Totally. You've connected to something that I think is soulful. You've mentioned in each of these examples, people, a place, and a moment in time. And I think that is where the deepest connections are in fiber. It's awesome.
Absolutely, 100%.
And thanks for sharing. I'm sure there's a lot of people maybe going to check out Harmony and Nunavut Kiviat now, just because you open the floodgates to possibilities that way.
Nunavut Kiviat is really quite an amazing company, and I've had the opportunity to speak to one of the, not the owner, but one of the people that works for them when the last time we were up in Whitehorse. And I would really encourage everybody, when you have a minute after this, go and look at their website and look at the prices of the yarn and the fiber. It's really illuminating when it's when it's priced fairly, taking into account the people at the other end, how much this stuff is truly worth. Yeah,
many of us can connect to that. It's the conversations we sometimes have about the cost of a handmade item, and how we've had to educate people about paying for that properly. So
100%.
We get it. So I've had the benefit of seeing some of your gorgeous knitting and weaving projects, but are you able to choose 1 to 3 favorites amongst your hand spun projects? Because we've learned that asking people to pick a favorite on this question is impossible. So
it is.
What are some of your favorite hand spun projects that you've done?
So I have like my magnum opus. I kind of couldn't not share this one because it's just kind of, so it's the Spark Cardigan by Maury. I can pull this a little bit closer if that would be helpful for people if they haven't seen this.
Yeah.
If I pull it too close, you actually will lose the patterning at the bottom. The reason why this is a magnum opus is because if anybody knows this pattern, this is the Spark by Maury. This is steeked. So it's completely 100% hand spun, and then the front is steeked. So it's worked top down, and then afterwards you've got your steeking lines at the front of the cardigan, and then you cut. And once you cut, that's it. So this is the back. This was a fractal 3-ply, 100% Shetland. It was our breeding color study that we did in our community, in the woolen spinning community last year. No, sorry, earlier this year. This year is such a blur. And we were looking at Shetland, and we were also looking at these particular colors and how they relate to one another. So we were looking at black, white, and naturally colored wools alongside sort of these other colors. And this yarn, the taupe color, is actually a 100% CVM that came from a woman in Colorado who was sort of having to shut down her farm, and her CVM Rommeldales were all being rehomed, and she had all of this fleece. And so there was a call put out to the woolen spinning community about, like, would anybody be willing to take these fleeces? And so my friend Greta, who's local to me, some of you will know her through the School of Sweet Georgia. Her and I actually took 2 of the fleeces, sent them to our friend Liz in Vermont, Kingdom Fleece and Fiber Works, and we got her to do pin drafted roving for us. And this is sort of what came out of that. And just, I don't really need to say much more. It was just one of those marathon spins, and then you're cutting it at the end. It's just like, are you kidding me?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Steeking and color work, if this were like a bingo of some kind, you would have already won. Yeah.
So that was that. The other thing too is that the yarn, the contrast color was spun semi worsted from a worsted preparation, and the CVM was woolen. It was 100% long draw from pin drafted roving, and they work beautifully together. You know, we spend all this time worrying about whether our yarns are, you know, going to work, and you know, oh, it isn't quite right, and so on and so forth. Don't worry about it. Just knit it.
Yeah,
Just
knit it
sample
up.
and knit.
It's beautiful. I can see why
Thank
that
you.
one stands out in the
Yeah.
amongst the projects.
Yeah, I'm excited to wear it this fall because I finished it in the spring. You might remember, Mars, and I couldn't wear it. It was way too hot because with all the stranded color work inside, it's basically like double knitting, right? Like you can't wear that when
Yeah,
it's
it'll be a coat
freezing.
for a couple weeks. That could be your coat.
100%. Yeah. Now this is old. This is, I made this back in like 2008 or 2009. And this is, so old for me. You know, it's 10 years old. It's got a hole in it actually. So I have to fix it. I found it last year and I still haven't fixed it. The reason why this is one of my favorites is actually not because it's, a very difficult pattern or because there was anything sort of difficult in it. It was the first time that I had carded together a whole bunch of random fibers. There's merino in here, there's Corriedale, there's sparkle, there's just a whole bunch of junk in here. And I carded it all together and made all of these nests and knitted into sort of a blanket shawl. And for whatever reason, I just kind of nailed it, like for myself. Like this is one of those things where if I don't know what to wear, I wear this. And it's just been one of those things that's just always been there for me. And now I have to repair it. So I have to be there for it. But it's absolutely massive. And I just love it.
It's even got those wardrobe staple colors in it. Like it looks like you could really wear that with just about anything else. That's amazing.
And it's so simple. Like it doesn't need to be complicated. You know, it can be very, very simple. And then from purely a wearability standpoint, I had to show you guys this. This is actually my favorite cardigan that I've ever made, except for my Gentle Morning. This is the Albini by Orlaine Souche. It's top down. I love this split at the back. It's a 100% hand spun sweater. It's a Romney mohair from a local to me ranch called Disdero. They're just up here in the Okanagan for those who are familiar with British Columbia. I just love this sweater. It's definitely, like, I would say it's probably my favorite sweater I've ever made. Yeah.
That's excellent. I think that the magic of making the yarn you really wanted is one thing, but then a finished product, a finished wearable that you then also love just feels like a huge bonus.
Feels like a win, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
Those are some good favorites. Well chosen.
Thank
you so much. That's our top 5 questions. And I've seen in the chat that we do have other questions from those who've joined us this month. And Mina's going to get us caught up on what some others would like to know from you.
Yes, absolutely. We only have like a couple of questions, so it shouldn't take too long. But if anyone does have any additional questions you want to ask Rachel, please pop them into the chat and I will make sure we get to them. So the first question was from Nicole. She says, I have a question. I know Rachel is a big advocate of rewinding worsted spun singles. Do you have any suggestions of the best way to do this without necessarily getting specific equipment? For example, with e-spinners, or is it okay with a Noster pin ball winder rather than rewinding onto another bobbin?
That is a great question, Nicole. I love that you are trying to do this in a more simple way. We like to complicate things because we like to buy things. Wind a plying ball, my friend, wind a plying ball. That's all you need to do. So leave your singles on your bobbins and then wind a plying ball. If you have never wound a plying ball before, just a couple, if you're not a spindle spinner, these are sort of a hack from spindle spinning. If you have not wound a plying ball before, there's a couple of things that you can do. You can use a little felted ball. So you can make a little felted ball by just some soap and water and mush it around into a circle. Or you can do what I do, and I just find a very lovely little rock that I think is really pretty that I want to keep. It's about yay big. And I start winding around that. And I like to, so this is a 2-ply yarn. I happen to be plying this on my spindle, but you could do this on your wheel. You wind it around your rock until you get to the end, and then you start plying. I will say, because you're holding on to your singles as you wind, you are sort of, manipulating the surface. So try to make sure that your hands are not rough and calloused and whatnot. And then the other thing that I would say is, as you're winding, if you're winding really super fresh singles that are really twisting back on themselves a lot and have a lot of twist in them, what I like to do is hold them between my finger just slightly, so that as I'm winding my plying ball, I'm laying them on flat onto the ball, so that they don't get all twisted up and you end up with singles, one longer and one shorter, where you get to that point, you've got a pigtail. So just be really aware, like this was quite active, these singles, and when I went to wind them, and I actually have a pigtail here that I found afterwards. But what I'll do is I'll kind of fix it when I get to it. So you can break it and just nest the other singles in there and kind of fix it. You don't need a whole bunch of extra equipment. You can absolutely use a ball winder. You can use a Nosta pin. If you're going to use a ball winder, stick if you have one of these Royal ball winders, like that has that's removable, put a paper, what's the word? A toilet paper roll around it. And then you can wind off onto that, like put the toilet paper roll around the middle of this and stick it into your ball winder, just so that you've got your singles are on something, that they don't just collapse down into themselves. Because if anybody has worked with active singles, once they collapse in on themselves, it's very difficult. But yeah, you don't need a whole bunch of fancy equipment.
I have to say that tip with the toilet paper roll on the ball winder, that right there was like, boom, light bulb moment. Why did I not think of that?
Yeah, I know.
I was like, I've seen so many people talk about doing like a center pull plying ball, and I know there's so many issues around like why you don't want to necessarily do that. I understand like how like the way the yarn twists as it comes off a center pull plying ball kind of screws with the twist in the yarn. I tried it a couple of times, mostly with like small, like sample amounts of fiber, and I'll be fine for the first bit. And then you get to that point where the whole thing just kind of just disintegrates essentially into itself. And then you just ended up with this like knotty mess that is only suitable to go into the bin. So that tip with the toilet paper roll is a good one. And yeah, winding, and that was another thing. Someone asked a clarifying question, and it was something I was thinking about as well, because I didn't realize it until you started explaining about not having the two strands twist up, that you were actually talking about winding two singles together, not just one single on its own. That was a clarifying question that came up, was like, you're talking about two strands at the same time?
Yes, winding two strands at the same time. So this happened to come off of two spindles. But you wind a traditional plying ball, when they talk about like Andean plying, like Abby Frankmont's written some articles on it, this is what they're talking about. Bracelet plying is bracelet plying. This is actually Andean plying. And she's written some great blog posts about it. But a plying ball, you can wind two singles together, you can wind three singles together, it doesn't matter. But it works really well to get you around that whole center pull ball issue, because you can wind one of these.
Yes, I'll definitely be giving that a go at some point.
Yeah. The other thing I would say about center pull balls, because they have such a bad reputation right now, and they've kind of been dragged through the mud a little bit. I feel kind of badly for the center pull ball. Is stick your thumb into it to keep it from collapsing. And the other thing is, if you have a really super fine wool that you're working with, like merino or even targi and Fulworth and stuff, the idea is that the singles that comes out of the inside is getting more twist than the singles that's coming from the outside. I would really encourage you to do some sampling and see if it's noticeable in your finished yarn after washing and finishing, because sometimes it's just easier to ply from a center pull ball, and you would never be able to tell that there's any more twist from that center singles.
I agree to a degree. I think, for example, like for most spinners, most people probably wouldn't notice the difference. Me, I tried the whole putting your thumb down the middle thing, and even that still doesn't work. It still doesn't work, because what happens is, as it's all coming off, it all comes off the end, and it's all just like getting into this bloody mess, and it's just, anyway, I just don't do it, basically.
That's because you've got lots of twist in those singles, Mina.
Yeah, also very impatient. I don't like letting my singles sit. I will spin the singles and ply on the same day. So I'm that type of person.
Oh yeah, there you go. Well, there's your problem.
That's the problem, yes. but yeah, no, okay. All really good tips. Definitely learned something there. Then we have another question came from Cheryl, and she's said that I won an Icelandic fleece and had it processed by a mill into roving. What would be the best way to spin it? I don't think they removed the coarser part of the fleece before processing it, and at the time I didn't know enough to ask. I tried doing a sample on a spindle and it was hard and rope-like, spun too tightly, I think.
100%. Great question, Cheryl. So most Icelandic fleeces are not separated. They are spun tog and thell together. The correct sort of way of referring to Icelandic wools and fleeces is the tog and the thell. It's only used for Icelandic. So when we start referring to tog and thell with other double-coated wools, it's actually not correct. Because we want to make sure that our language is correct. So with the tog and the thell, I just happen to have some Icelandic sitting on my table here. So Cheryl, great question. So Icelandic tends to be when you receive it, this is in comb top form. This is part of the spinning sheep breeds kit from School of Sweet Georgia for my new workshop, and it tends to be a bit hairy and a bit fuzzy. I'll see if I can show you guys. I don't know if my hair gives enough of a contrast there. So you've got short bits and long bits. And as you spin, there's a couple of things to think about. You're spinning multiple staple lengths. So you've got your long outer hairs. And then if you keep pulling this apart, it's a little bit too thin now. You've got your shorter, softer inner bits. And I'm not going to be able to pull it all apart to show you. It'll take too long. But if you take some combs and you pull and you start combing it, you'll find as you draft off your combs, you'll find that there's longer, shorter fibers in that. And that's in every single comb top, every single roving, if you take the time to do that with all of your fibers, you'll actually be amazed at the range of staple lengths that you have and what you think is a really super uniform comb top. It's not uniform at all. It's just that the majority of the fibers happen to be medium length. They happen to be 1 to 3 inches long, and you happen to hold your fingers that distance. And so you're generally successful. That's why it works. And that's why we all love spinning this stuff. And so with like Icelandic, for example, you've got a bigger range now. So you're working with a fiber that's got a bigger range, and all of a sudden where your hands traditionally sit, how you traditionally spin is sort of no longer working quite so well. So if you have any let lopi in your stash, or if you have access to going and looking at it in the store, have a look at how low twist that yarn is. It's 100% Icelandic. It's incredibly low twist. Some of them we think as knitters, oh, that's a singles yarn. If you deconstruct some of them, not all of them, but some of them, if you deconstruct them and take the twist out and be very intentional about this, they're actually incredibly low twist 2-ply yarns where they've been plied so that you can't see the twist angle of the 2-ply. They just look like a singles yarn. So to the untrained eye and to the somebody who wouldn't know to look a bit closer, so they look like singles yarns. So take the pressure off of yourself. Recognize that this is a new to you fiber, that there are people that do their master spinner certificates and spend their entire final project just on how to spin Icelandic and how to spin these yarns and these fibers, and just give yourself some grace and spend some time playing with it, and drop your twist. You need a heavy spindle if you're going to do it on a spindle, and you need very little twist. And I would actually encourage you to even if it's a top whorl spindle and it's like traditionally a drop whorl, a drop spindle, turn it the other way around and use it as a support spindle so that you can use it like this so that you can work on not worrying about dropping the spindle because you don't have enough twist. And you can just focus on spinning really soft singles, and don't try to spin thin. This is not the time to be spinning lace weight. This is the time to be spinning and plying to like DK worsted weight. So when you're drafting and you split this down, I would split it to about the width of my my pointer finger, and I would be planning to spin to about yay width. So like, 9 wraps per inch. That's what I would be planning with about that much twist.
You can see it's not even falling apart. You're just holding it there and it's just hanging.
Holding it. It doesn't even fall apart. That's how, like, these are like coarser wools, right? Like there's a reason why people are like, oh my goodness, it turned to rope. 100%, because these are not merino. These are coarser, toothier wools. I hate the word coarse. Anybody who follows me knows that. These are just, they're a different, they literally have a different molecular structure than like a merino does. They're literally different fiber. That's why wool is so cool. That's why I want to talk about structure all the time.
Funny that you were talking about how some of the Let Low P yarns are, when they look like singles, but they're actually really softly spun 2-ply. I've noticed that with like majority of the commercially available like singles yarns, if you sit there and untwist the singles, you'll find that they're actually two very softly spun. It's actually a very softly spun 2-ply. It's not a true single.
100%.
Most of them are like that, which I thought was really interesting. I can't remember who I heard that from first, but
There's some fascinating, Alden Amos talks about it in his book.
Okay.
That there's, that commercial yarns often, the singles are spun just to hold together. And that's why we get so much pilling. And, once you start spinning, you don't want to work with anything else, because of course your commercial yarns, they're usually, once you go back, they're a little bit disappointing. Yeah.
It's not the magic is not the same. They have their own magic, but the magic is not the same.
It's just not quite the same. I will say about
points, I made some notes about what you just said, Rachel, about Icelandic, and I'm literally going to put this piece of paper into the bag that has my Icelandic fleece in it,
awesome.
because I had never heard it so clearly explained before.
Oh, good.
So thanks for that.
Can I say one more thing about the primitives?
So
I could talk about the primitives until the cows come home, but I will say this one thing. We did this on the podcast yesterday. So it's episode 216. It's the Jacob episode. We try the primitives always get overspun because we're so used to spinning Polworth and Targhee and all these amazing other things. And so we made these two samples, and the one on this side, the thinner one, is overspun and wiry. This is Jacob. And this one is softer spun, lower twist, more air was left in the singles. And you can see how different those yarns are. This feels wiry and it's stiff and it's overspun. It would probably be good for weaving, but this one here would just be an incredible sweater yarn, and it looks underspun and under twisted, but it actually would be an incredible sweater yarn. And a lot of it's just because it's not soft, quote unquote, like the fine wools. These primitive wools are a little bit toothier, a little bit coarser. They can withstand a lot more wear and tear, and they don't need as much twist.
Absolutely. And hey, once you get into the rhythm of it, it's a much faster spin because you're not having to treadle as much. There we go.
Funny story, Mina. I actually find them very fast to spin. That's so funny you would say that. Yeah. Yeah.
You're talking to the person who has very low like patience levels. So I'm the opposite of you. I'm a fast spinner. I'm not a slow spinner. So I've watched, I'm also part of your Patreon. So it's like the videos, every time you talk about how slow you spin, I'm like, yeah, no, not
my
me.
hands are fast, my feet are slow. So that's why I have to use such high ratios.
Yeah.
Because my feet are so slow.
I treadle really fast. Like sometimes I actually have to like talk myself into slowing down because I treadle too fast.
Yeah.
Okay. So next question we have from Mel. She says, do you feel like weaving is more forgiving than knitting when it comes to using singles?
That's a great question, Mel. I'm actually not sure. I don't know that I can speak to that. Singles just in general are, they haven't been plied. So there's sort of a certain inconsistency about them that just doesn't sort of, work its way out in the plying process. So even the most consistently spun singles still have a little bit of inconsistency to them. And they also, there's nothing that's balanced them, so they're always going to sort of bias one way or the other. Even if it's not super noticeable in your knitting, they're going to have that slight shift depending on which way you spun them. I've woven with my singles. I've also knit with my singles. I haven't found that one is more forgiving than the other. I think the thing too with the weaving is if you're fulling your fabric really well and you're really kind of allowing that yarn, that sort of the woolly characteristics to really come through in your finished woven piece. So you're really, maybe you're machine washing the cloth and then throwing it in the dryer, or hand washing it and then throwing it in the dryer, whatever you decide. If you're really fulling it, you're going to end up with a sort of, regardless of sort of what you've made, you're going to end up with a really nice piece of woven fabric. So yeah, I'm not sure I can answer if one's more forgiving than the other, but I think that singles, like there's a lot of old textiles that have been found, because of course textiles don't sort of stand the test of time because they disintegrate. A lot of stuff that has been found was all singles. They didn't slow down to ply. And I think a lot of it's because they didn't have time. They were just making stuff, they had to get it made. So I think that's an interesting thing to keep in the back of our minds. We worry about, to ply or not to ply, or should be a 3-ply, should be a 4-ply. Doesn't matter. Just make the thing and see, and then take those learnings to your next project.
Absolutely. All right, so we have one more question, and that is from Ange, and she says, when you are browsing through patterns to knit, are there certain stitch patterns, knitting techniques that you are drawn to because from experience they will be great for showing off hand spun yarn?
That's a great question. Hi, Ange, by the way. She's a friend of mine. So interesting, because we share in the Slack channel in my community and also on Ravelry in the bundles. We have sort of started this library of patterns for hand spun. And I think when I first started spinning, I felt like I went out looking specifically for projects that I thought were for patterns that were yeah, that's for hand spun. And now I don't do that at all. And I think what's changed is my experience and my level of experience, because the reality is all yarn can be made into all patterns. And you can pretty much modify or change your gauge and do the math on anything. But I think when it comes to certain stitch patterns and actual knitting, like the actual techniques, one of the things that I look for is, am I wanting to highlight in a project? These two sweaters are actually great examples. Do I want to highlight the yarn, or do I want to highlight the color and the pattern? And it's not so much looking for a specific pattern or a specific technique or a specific designer or a specific yarn. It's more, is this project about the yarn, or is it about color and texture and pattern? A lot of patterning stitches in knitting. Garter is one of those funny things. Garter is really textured. People have until you knit garter in a marled hand spun yarn, you don't realize how textured garter stitch is. So you can't, for me personally, I don't like having the competition between the color or the yarn and the texture of the stitches. It needs to be one or the other. And I think often when people, they'll post in the Slack channel or they'll post on the Ravelry group and they'll say, this isn't working and I don't know why. And I thought this pattern would work for this yarn and it's not working. And it's usually because one of those things is competing. Either the color work is getting lost because the yarns aren't the right yarns, there's too much, there's not enough contrast, or it's too contrasty, or there's too much stitch patterning and definition in the actual stitches themselves, and the yarn is too loud and you can't see anything. The eye doesn't know where to go. So for me, I'm drawn to the patterns that will highlight what I'm trying to highlight in that particular project. And I'm also getting to the point now where more and more I'm looking at the sweaters that I want to add to my wardrobe, because I have a lot of sweaters now, so I don't want to add a lot more. I want it to be very strategic. So I've started now looking at the pattern and picking the pattern first and then working backwards. And that's a big change for me, because before it was always make the yarn, do the yarn, finish the yarn, and then find a pattern, which ends up with a lot of hours of ripping and reknitting.
Yep.
And with weaving, you can't rip it out.
Yeah. I agree with you. It's funny because I get questions a lot as well from people being like, oh, which of your because I design patterns as well, so people are like, oh, so which of your patterns are great for hand spun? I'm like, well, all of them.
All of them. Mhm.
Any pattern is good for hand spun. That's the thing.
Yeah.
Well, how
It depends. What are you spinning?
Yeah.
How much
And what's the point?
how much work are you willing to put in to kind of make those slight modifications? I mean, I have a bunch of patterns out now that are designed with hand spun specifically, or that I have hand spun samples as well of the same pattern, just to be like, look, it can be done. Like, it's not a nothing is exclusively hand spun only, and nothing is exclusively commercial yarn only. You know, limitation is what you are willing to do, really. And a lot of my hand spun patterns, the main thing that I focus on with like a hand spun design for me is creating a pattern that's more like a recipe.
Yes.
So it gives you the flexibility to have inconsistent yardage or different yardage amounts than whatever the pattern calls for. And you're working to like percentage amounts before you move on to something else. So I guess if you're a beginner with hand spun and you're looking for patterns and you're looking for something that makes it a bit easier, it would be maybe look for something that's more percentage recipe based than a strict, you have to hit X number of stitches before you do the next thing kind of thing. But otherwise, I agree with you. Any pattern is a hand spun pattern, really. There's no limit there.
As you were talking, Mina, one of the things that comes to me too is that one of the things that has recently really affected whether or not I choose a pattern is the content of my yarn. And that's new for me. I never really thought about it before, but now with this past year, our community's been looking at luxury. And for the first time, this is a really good problem to have. So I'm kind of laughing at myself, but for the first time, I had this yarn that was a 50-50 merino Kiviot yarn, and I had to figure out what to make. And all of a sudden, everything didn't really work because this yarn acted so differently. And if we have, do we have a minute, Mars, that I can show everybody what I ended up making?
Absolutely. I think we all want to.
I know we're kind of a little bit longer. So what I ended up doing was these mittens that were actually, they were in Jillian Moreno's book actually. But this, I ended up, these are called, this is the Hive Mind pattern. It's one by Adrienne Basilica. I can never say her last name. Hello Yarn. Everybody knows Hello Yarn. But for the first time, I had a big problem because anything that I put with this merino Kiviot yarn, which is the natural gorgeous gray, it's that beautiful gray brown that is the Kiviot. I happened to have some locks in my stash of merino that were the same color. So it was just totally kismet. You try to find a yarn to go with that that's high enough contrast for colorwork mitts. It was actually really, really difficult. And the other thing that was really difficult was the actual yarn itself was so soft. And because of the Kiviot, it's got quite the halo. It obscures all colorwork. And, you know, in some ways, like the red, that's a stash BFL. It was a yarn that I had already spun, that it needed to be way brighter and way more like the contrast. It ended up with a very low contrast. They register as the same value when you take a black and white photo. And as your spinning kind of expands and as you work with more and more and more fibers, those are the considerations that you start taking into account that have absolutely nothing to do with the designer, the pattern, the garment, what you're making. It's all about like, how do you use this yarn? Like, where do I even begin?
Yeah. No, it's funny. I was looking at that and I was like, actually, I personally really like the low contrast. I think it looks really beautiful and quite almost classic, but it gives it a bit of a vintage vibe because it always looks like it's faded a bit. But you always need a neon color to go with that. To like really,
yeah. You need like raw.
Yeah. But no, I think the red, even though it is quite subtle and quite a subtle contrast, I think it looks really beautiful with it. And
it's really, they're pretty and they're going to be unbelievably warm for when we're
Yes.
up north. Our long-term plan is to actually live in Whitehorse for a little while, and we're in the process of figuring it all out. And we're gonna need some stuff. So
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay, I think we've come to the end of this recording session. So for those of you who are joining us over on YouTube, thank you so much for joining. We will have links to everything below in the description box, to all the places you can find Rachel and to some of these other websites we've been chatting about. Otherwise, hopefully we'll see you guys next month. All right.
Yeah.